Rising debt, a weakening economy and spiralling unemployment are threatening to push South Africa to the brink. Again, recently the National Development Planning Commission warned the country may have to turn to the International Monetary Fund for help. President Ramaphosa started his tenure as head of state with the promise of an economic stimulus package to turn the country's economy around. He also made it clear that the country would not go to the IMF for assistance.
So, is it IMF? No, we're not looking at the IMF. The New Development Bank has a facility that can be made available to us, and we are exploring that as well, and want to do it in a way where it does not require a sovereign guarantee.
But on Monday, the IMF said South Africa's economic recovery plan faced serious constraints. It identified the growing debt of state-owned enterprises, labour regulations and policy uncertainty as problematic. Our US correspondent Simon Marks explains.
This report on a variety of issues, including the issue pertaining to the mining sector. The IMF is arguing for a much more classically liberal economic approach to life, an approach to life that traditionally, of course, the IMF favours because it is an enormous supporter of free market capitalism.
So is going to the IMF with a begging bowl really the solution? To answer these questions, tonight we talk to Kanti Pai, economist from Analysts Advisory and Research, and Professor Patrick Bond of Wits University. Very warm welcome, gentlemen. Kanti, do you think Cyril Ramaphosa is going to be tempted and go to the IMF?
Look, I think politically that's not the best thing that he can do at this time. Remember that part of the whole system of the ANC was always to oppose the idea of going to the IMF because it constrains, freedom. It's not about self-determination, and so it would be a really hard pill to swallow for his comrades to suddenly actually have to find themselves at the IMF. The one thing that they always said that they didn't want to do.
I'm not sure how many countries really want to go that route anyway, do they? It's like, no, but please take me. Would Cyril Ramaphosa be tempted, and what would push him to make that sort of decision?
Jane, I think it's usually a matter of desperation. And the last time South Africa went repeatedly, 1976 after the Soweto uprising, 1982 after the gold price had fallen from $850 an ounce to $250. And then in 1993, we were at the IMF just to get credibility for Nelson Mandela. It was Pravin Gordhan who had actually signed the Transitional Executive Council. It was an $850 million loan. We've avoided the IMF, although there have been big World Bank loans since then. The big question is about $180 billion foreign debt now. Some of it coming due early next year. About $2 billion has to be paid, so those tranches will be difficult. Would the contingent reserve arrangement of the BRICS be the alternative? And that's what President Ramaphosa meant to say. He said the New Development Bank. But that contingent reserve arrangement of the BRICS actually strengthens the IMF, because once we get $3 billion from them, we need another $7 billion to get to our quota. But before we get that, you have to go to the IMF to get a structural adjustment program according to the Articles of Agreement. So it seems like we're just stuck in this rut if we start getting into that sort of trouble.
What happens when the IMF focuses on South Africa and its problems and knowing what it needs? What sort of message is it to South Africa and people who want to get involved in South Africa?
Look, I think there's been two types of issues that IMF brings up. Most of them are things we already know, right? These structural adjustments around SOEs, or escalating debt, all of those things. But then there are also some things that are uncomfortable. For example, they talk about, that we have to sort out our costs of doing business. This is one of their latest reports on South Africa. That also means, what they actually mean by that is that our labor costs are too high, that we might actually have to limit, how much we raise, wages on a year-on-year basis. They talk about productivity. These are difficult things to do, right? They talk about, minimum wages. These are, discussions that we have in South Africa around our own structure. How do we actually deliver on inequality and fix that problem? Those are things that would be very difficult for us to do, to say. They think about privatization of SOEs. Again, a very thorny issue for us. And so that's why I was saying that there's a difficulty, there's this tension between the things we know we must do and the things that we feel that we can't do, that are just not exactly, those are the things that we just
But you've hit the nail on the head with the IMF. It's all about cut, isn't it? And it's how you balance the growth that you need, that a country needs while cutting back, which the IMF desires.
And yet there is a schizophrenia, and that is because you're absolutely right at the micro level. When they are doing a structural adjustment program, it's very much about, as Greece went through 5 years ago, as Argentina is going through now, absolute devastation to your social programs, your pensions, your health programs.
And those are the people you really need to keep working.
Well, and to keep people alive, because you had in both these cases terrible suicide rates going up. But the schizophrenic part, Jane, is that they also want the world economy to grow during recessions. Now, we've got a sort of high growth, sugar high, let's call it, from all of the stimulus from tax cuts in the Trump era and financialization. But once that crashes, and we had it in 98, we had it in 2008, we're having it now in a drawn-out way. Usually the IMF should come in and say, well, you should borrow more. And that's what they really want from us, to make South Africa a major debtor. And I think that's the kind of danger that we would then say, well, what would an alternative be to going to Washington or going to the BRICS institutions, which actually reinforce them? And I think there we should ask, should we repay some of the debts? So we've had on Friday Treasury reports on the corrupt China Development Bank loans that went to Transnet, to Eskom, $5 billion each. We had the World Bank loan for Medupi, the big power plant that was corrupt with Hitachi and Chancellor House. It's time to ask, pay back the money? Who should pay back the money? These are what are technically, I think, termed odious debts.
Odious debts. And do you think that obviously we've got to deal with our economy now, but if you look at Greece's government debt to GDP is 160%, ours is 53%, looks small in comparison. Do you think we are jumping the gun here in this conversation?
Look, we have some serious problems. If you think, for example, about our debt financing costs, they're over 10% now of our entire budget on an annual basis. So that suggests that even though we might be at 53% of debt, that actually our capacity to keep paying is starting to get a little bit more constrained than ever, because obviously, because some countries can manage 100%, some countries can't even manage 20% of debt to GDP. So it depends really where you are. And I think we're starting to suggest here that where we are is a very uncomfortable area. And actually, we wouldn't have to need to go to the IMF if we did the right things that we know we must do. I think there's been that lack of bravery from the government, because also you don't want it to come from an external force, shall we call it. Those are the things that we know we can do. How we actually manage SOEs, including what a couple of years ago Minister Godin said, that they would find, for example, strategic partners in terms of our SOEs. So I guess a better way to say privatization, allowing them a little bit of cash injection, allowing us to be able to, at the same time, make them a little bit more efficient on being able to deliver. So you wouldn't sell them wholesale, but you would actually allow them to do a little bit better, to get somebody else to inject into these companies, and that would free the government a little bit. So these are things that we have to be a little bit more creative, to apply ourselves, and to be a little bit braver than we've been before.
What direction do you think we're going to end up here? What decisions?
Well, particularly because what the ratio, you said 53% public debt to GDP, it's heading north. We'll probably be in the 60% range for a while, because we have a very slow economy. We have a private sector that is refusing to invest. But listen, the crucial thing is not the domestic public debt. You can print rand to deal with that. Don't do it like Zimbabwe. But you can deal with it because it's your currency. The dilemma is where the IMF comes in, they squeeze you because of its foreign debt.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, and precisely that we can't print US dollars. They can't do it in Zim either. They try, but they can't. And I think the crucial thing is, if you've got a dollar debt, which is now, let's say, 180 billion.
Has it.
Yes, and then you're going to need to export to raise dollars. But actually, at the same time, you've got illicit financial flows. We're about $20 billion a year. It's one of the highest in the world per capita. We've got to really tighten those exchange controls to deal with that. And then we would ask, well, maybe this foreign debt is way too high. We have a very open financial system. We've got lots of foreign investors coming, but they want profits and dividends and interest back. And when the last time we were at about 40% debt to GDP, PW Botha in 1985 actually had to default on $13 billion of foreign debt at the time. So this is a dangerous terrain where I think all of the options, including exchange controls and questioning corrupt lenders like the World Bank, like the China Development Bank. They knew there was corruption with the Guptas and with Hitachi and Chancellor House. Why should we, as South Africans, be paying back loans? There should be some lender liability, and then we could get that $180 billion, I think, to a little bit more reasonable level.
Clearly, we've got to do something. Patrick Bond and Clancy Pai, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Coming up, we take a look at children with an awareness of world issues.